Hello and welcome to this video overviewing quantitative research. I'm Kristen Kinsevich, a doctoral student at Regent University in the Counselor Education and Supervision program. This video will cover validity, types of quantitative research designs, data collection, threats to validity, and limitations of quantitative research. Much of the information has been adapted from Research Design in Counseling, the 4th edition by Hepner and colleagues. Let's talk about validity. There's three main types of validity: internal, external, and construct. When a quantitative study has internal validity, the degree of certainty about the conclusions regarding a causal relationship between the variables is shown. So that tells you that if you have a high internal validity, you are very sure that the conclusions you're coming to are accurate in your relationship between those variables. External validity refers to the generalizability of the conclusions to other populations or settings. So if you conduct a true experiment, which we'll talk about in a minute, it may not be as high in external validity because some of the conditions in a laboratory, for example, might not be the same as what you might find in the real world. And finally, construct validity refers to the degree to which the measured variables accurately represent the hypothesized construct. So are you actually measuring what you say you're measuring? There are several types of quantitative research designs. The first, as I mentioned, is a true experiment. And this is high in internal validity because you're controlling the most number of factors, because it's a highly controlled environment, again, maybe in a lab, or excluded from kind of real world. You're controlling as many factors as possible, and so it's likely that the conclusions that you draw about how your variables ended up relating will be accurate. You use the max-min-con principle, which is really trying to maximize the variance, meaning you want your groups to be as different as possible if you're showing that your intervention or independent variable is really making a difference. You also are trying to minimize error, meaning that you are avoiding a faulty conclusion. And you're trying to control unwanted or random variables. So again, in a laboratory type of setting, you can kind of set things up exactly how you want it to be. But this may have a low external validity because in the real world, those conditions may not exist. More often, you would see a quasi-experiment in which you might have non-random groups, for example, some kind of pre-existing cohort, like a classroom of children or a group therapy that's already formed. This saves time and money, it's real-world feasible, and there is higher external validity because it's more similar to real-world settings, but there might possibly be lower internal validity, meaning you might come to a conclusion that may or may not be accurate or correct. There's also correlational research designs in which you're just looking at a relationship between variables and you're not comparing groups necessarily. And there's mixed methods as well, where you're using a combination of quantitative and qualitative methods. So if you give a population a survey and then you also do some interviews, that would be an example of mixed methods. Now, a true experiment and a quasi-experiment could have a couple of different options. One is a between groups design, and this is when you have a control group versus a treatment group, or you could have several groups. So you could have a control group and treatment 1 and treatment 2, or something like that. So you're comparing groups. And then within subject design would be the same set of subjects multiple times. So you could do a pre-test and post-test, or you could have multiple observations over time with more than one intervention point. You could also do any of these ex post facto, meaning that you are using archival or previously collected data, and you could do that between groups or within subjects if you already have the data collected. Obviously, that wouldn't be an experiment in the sense that you did not influence those factors. So again, that would fall under a quasi-experiment. Data collection can be in a lab or in the field. You can use observation or assessment by trained researchers. So sometimes there's a set of kind of codes or kind of agreed upon rules where observers are coding and writing down the frequency of certain events. Or you can have a previously validated instrument or assessment that you're using, so you could have some psychologists go in and, do the MMPI with a certain population and compare groups from that. You can also do something like a survey, which obviously the participant themselves would just respond. And again, you can do this kind of once, a one-time survey, or a pre-test, post-test where there's an intervention in between, or this time series idea where you make multiple measurements over a longer period of time. There's some threats to validity. Obviously, environmental influences can falsely change some of your dependent variables when you're trying to show that you are connecting this particular independent variable and a specific dependent variable. Maybe there's other factors you're not considering. There's also natural maturation over time. So if you are doing a time series or pre-test, post-test type design, then how do you account for kind of just natural growth? Maybe they would learn anyway, or maybe depression symptoms would decrease anyway. So how do you show that it was actually that intervention that made the difference? You could have a poor instrument or survey if questions are poorly worded, or the instrument really doesn't measure what you're claiming that it should measure. Again, that would be a construct validity problem. You could have testing effects as well. So a pre-test could influence a post-test. Let's say you wanted to test the impact of a certain intervention on the Myers-Briggs test. Well, once you've taken the Myers-Briggs test, if you know your results, or even if you didn't find out your results, you might kind of answer the questions on the post-test in a certain way because you've already taken it once before. Also, if there's non-random selection, like with a quasi-experiment, that could be a threat to validity because you could come to a false conclusion and it may not be generalizable, or it might be even internally not valid. And again, we mentioned poor definition of constructs. There are some limitations of quantitative research. Small sample sizes would be a problem. It's hard to conduct statistical tests accurately with a small sample size. If you don't have a control group, that can be a limitation because you may not have a kind of neutral comparison. Sometimes quantitative research can lack multicultural considerations, partly because a lot of times it's easiest to get a big group in a university setting. And so a lot of research has been done on, 18 to 23-year-olds, men more white than not. And so sometimes that is a limitation that needs to be acknowledged. Self-reporting has limitations in the sense that you're taking someone's memory or their assessment of themselves to be true, and that may or may not be the case. And you might fail to measure or account for all of the different meaningful variables or covariates, so you might miss something that actually had an impact as well. That's it. I hope this video has been helpful, and I'll see you next time.